Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, maybe good morning to some. My name is Stephen Lezak, and I'm just one of our five panelists today, and I'm going to be helping to facilitate our conversation. And I wanted to welcome you all to the World Salon Digital Fireside series on climate change and international relations. The topic of today's conversation is cooperation or competition, climate finance, national security, and urban futures. And we have a terrific panel of people here today for a great conversation. And I'll jump in with some introductions. We have Dr. Daniele Visioni, who is an assistant professor in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. Dr. Visioni is recognized for his cutting-edge research on climate modeling and geoengineering, and his recent work includes studies on the potential and risks of stratospheric aerosol injection and explores how targeted interventions might help mitigate global temperature rise. Dr. Visioni has published in leading journals such as Nature Communications, Environmental Research Letters, and has contributed to the evolving scientific dialogue on both the efficacy and ethics of climate intervention. We also have Dr. Jan Whittington, who is a global authority on infrastructure economics and climate finance, and serves as a professor of urban design and planning at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's the founding director of the Urban Infrastructure Lab and is an associate of the Tech Policy Lab, and has led projects across more than 30 countries, advising municipal governments on integrating climate adaptation and mitigation strategies into their core capital investment and budgeting processes. We have Louisa Casson, who is a global project leader at Greenpeace International and spearheads high-profile campaigns to create ocean sanctuaries and prevent the launch of deep-sea mining. She played a pivotal role in winning political support for a landmark high seas treaty and the commitment to protect at least 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. Casson's leadership has extended to on-the-ground and on-the-sea expeditions, where she works alongside scientists and activists to document the threats to marine ecosystems across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Antarctic oceans. And we have Johan Falk, who is a strategist, entrepreneur, and co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, where he champions rapid decarbonization aligned with the 1.5 degree C target. As the lead author of the Exponential Roadmap and 1.5 degree C business playbook, Johan has collaborated with multinational corporations and policymakers to catalyze transformative climate solutions. He has also initiated the 1.5 degree C Supply Chain Leaders Group and co-invented the Doggins Industry Climate Index, underscoring his commitment to tangible, data-driven progress. And my name is Stephen Lezak. I am a researcher. I split my time at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Oxford. I work on climate justice and carbon markets. I do quite a bit of research up here in the high north in Alaska, indigenous communities, working on tribal climate governance, and also work on decarbonizing supply chains in high integrity ways, both with and without the use of carbon credits. And it is absolutely a delight to welcome our panelists and our guests. We're going to jump right in. We have a question for each of our five panelists, and then we'll open the floor to a broader discussion after that. So we'll start. Jan Whittington, given your global experience advising cities on their capital budgeting processes, how can urban centers become not just passive recipients of climate finance, but active leaders in driving climate smart investments and regional resilience?
Thanks, Stephen, for that kind introduction, and I really appreciate this question. I've worked with over 300 cities around the world on integrating climate into their regular capital planning and budgeting processes, and from there into finance. And what I can say is that there is a pretty broad continuum of capacity for local entities to initiate change. And a lot of that has to do with funding and finance. This is not new news in the climate space, but if we're thinking locally, there is a lot that cities that have autonomy over their own revenues can do within their existing capital planning and budgeting cycles. So think about I've long thought about the climate problem, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, as an infrastructure substitution problem that incorporates, different designs and different dependencies, of course, on energy sources, but also changes in design and the way that we work with the landscape for things like adaptation. And at the local scale, that's where architecture and engineering collide with the sense of
Hmm.
available revenues and the scope of what's possible for climate action. And I think that in many ways, what people talk about when they work on or work with NDCs and other measures at the international scale, eventually that's going to become some kind of aggregate of not only what is possible, but an accounting for what is actually happening at the local scale. So, in other words, the climate action is local action, but reported in aggregate. So if you're in a local government and you're able to take action through your own budgeting and capital development process, and you may also be in a position as many local governments are in the U.S. and some other countries as well. They're they're able to be local governments can act as market makers too. They can have some influence over what their energy utilities do, or their ability they can exercise increasingly an ability to bypass those existing locked in fossil fuel generating sources and form their own power purchasing agreements for utility scale renewables. So we're seeing that movement happening increasingly, not just in the United States, but there have been some movements that way in India and in parts of Europe as well. I think uh, then if you're in an environment that where own source revenues aren't really a thing and you don't have a great deal of control over the nature of the projects that get designed and developed in your local government in your local jurisdiction, chances are that you're much more dependent on funds that flow down from a higher unit of government, whether that's provincial or national, and have a stronger relationship with multilateral or bilateral development banks for your development, in which case avenues for change can be very much attached to the programmatic requirements or incentive structures that are built into those systems for that revenue to flow down and incentivize change at the local level. So, for instance, I've worked on, World Bank efforts to incorporate changes to capital planning processes and design procedures that would have, in order to qualify for municipal level grants and concessional financing, requirements that projects be, climate aligned and designed appropriately for mitigation and adaptation. So that's a lot to get us started with. But I do think that the hard problem in many ways exists at this local level and being able to scale up. And folks writing to an audience at the global scale have long complained that there really isn't an effective project pipeline for climate ready capital. And I do think that this is in many ways what they're talking about. They are the $4 trillion municipal bond market still has fewer than 15% of its content be, have a green or climate label applied to it. And that's not necessarily a problem of labeling as much as it is a problem of having that pipeline of projects into the financial world be climate ready. So yeah,
Great.
that's my
And Janet,
answer to launch us off.
terrific. And a quick follow-up. This is, I imagine, a lot of our viewers today are calling in from the United States, where we've seen federal funding for climate infrastructure projects quite possibly sort of vanish in a way that many of us thought was inconceivable if you had asked us 2 months ago. And I can imagine a lot of municipalities, certainly in the United States, but I imagine all over the world, are wondering how reliable long-term sources of climate funding are, and what options there are to sort of future-proof these massive capital investments. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts in that direction about how the landscape for municipal or small jurisdiction funding for capital-intensive climate projects might have shifted in the last couple of months, and what solutions and safeguards are available going forward.
Yeah, I get this question a lot from folks. I have a few thoughts about it. One is that a lot of investments that were coming through the Inflation Reduction Act were meant to do two things. One is to further subsidize the development, the scale development of renewables, and in the process have the costs come down for those renewables even further. We have a long history of having the cost of renewables come down, and continuing to sort of prime that pump of development and competition in the sector, I think it is critical and important. But that really doesn't impact the revenues and the expenditures at the local level per se, right? It is a subsidy that can affect the price of certain things on the market, but it doesn't take away from local government's capacity to enact change at that local level. Another category of major investment that the Inflation Reduction Act was setting up has been funds specifically for community organizations, or eventually to reach community organizations. So within the scale of a city, there you can have neighborhood and community subunits that are meant to be proposing and receiving grants for very, very local, hyper local investments. Rooftop on that neighborhood community, rooftop solar on that neighborhood community center, if you will, that scale of project change. And so all of those sources of funding are somewhat at risk, and none of them necessarily involve a local government, typical local government action. So while they could have been more meaningful over time, their loss, I don't want to say their loss has no impact. I mean, it will have some impact. Some grants were flowing down for EV charging systems and the transition of fleets to electric and that sort of thing. But local governments can still be the powerhouses that they were meant to be. I think some of the more interesting areas of change are more like institutional changes. Like, for instance, being able to allow local governments to play more effectively for their own interests in the provision of renewable energy on the grid. And those kinds of plays, I think, are just growing in number and proportion these days. So I guess that's good news, right? So if you were worried about the federal retreat impacting local government capacity, it will have some impact on the margin, but the core revenues and their categories of expenditures are not materially changing as far as I can see.
Great. Thank you, Jan. And I'm going to apologize in advance if my internet is cutting out. It's a little dodgy today in Alaska. But I want to turn to Johan Falk. And Johan, I wanted to ask about how climate finance mechanisms, leading on from our conversation about municipal climate bonds, how can these climate finance mechanisms and others be more effectively designed and mobilized to help small and medium enterprises adopt, for example, the 1.5 degree C business playbook, particularly in regions with limited resources?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Just checking, can you hear me clearly, or?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thanks. Great. We set up something called the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which brings together the leading sort of innovators, transformers, and disruptors aligned with the 1.5 ambition, to supporting them in the transformation and collective action, but also influencing the global narrative like the Exponential Roadmap. And one thing we also initiated a couple of years ago together with UN, and there was something called the SME Climate Hub. So like a free open resource for small companies to be able to commit to halve emissions by 2030, to get access to free and simplified reporting of progress. And that has been growing, has close to 10,000 companies. So that's a good start, I would say. But there is a tremendous potential, of course, in terms of the SMEs. First, I would say it's a really important part of our economy, of course. And there is a risk that most of the action is with the large companies, and that we leave the small companies. From a competitive viewpoint, it's really important to support the small companies to be part of the transformation and to be able to contribute to that. And that can be done in two ways. You have both small companies that need to sort of decarbon operation, but small companies are also very essential in providing the next generation solutions, which is phasing out the fossil economy. So when the large companies transform their value chains, they need to bring innovation and technologies both upstream from the supplier base and downstream, because that is how you have to do it, both to cut first 50% and then the next going down, towards net zero. That's a bit the background. Now, the small companies, what is really important from their perspective is, of course, they're limited in time and capability. So they need to be incentivized. And the most important incentive customers really requesting them or incentivize them to take climate action, which could be, well, concrete action, not only commitment, but more focusing on action and simplified reporting. And that is potential there to actually accelerate that, because so far the large companies have focused on, their large supplier base. So most large companies haven't really requested their small suppliers to take action. That's something that we are pushing from our perspective. The second angle will come from the financial institutions, the banks, and so on, supporting their small customers to take climate action. So that's also happening. So the incentives and the small companies are primarily revenue driven. I think it's coming from that perspective, and there is a big potential. Now, key point which where there is a tremendous opportunity is, of course, that we would have better supporting policies. So that to exemplify that would be to be able to shift vehicle fleet, for example, and in terms of energy efficiency, where you for companies driving manufacturing, of course, shifting to renewable energy, and specifically in the farming sector, if talking about shifting to regenerative agriculture and more sustainable forestry. So there is a tremendous potential, as far as I see it, to raise these incentives for this, and that has to come, I think, also from a policy perspective. There is also an opportunity, of course, through credits. We're talking about regen ag and sustainable forestry. So I think it comes down very, very much incentives and finally simplification. We can't push too hard requirements of small companies just to report. I think the key point is simplification and incentivization for small companies. I'll stop there for the time being.
Terrific moment. Do you all have me back?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Johan. I think let's, I'm sure we're going to return to those topics, but I want to move on to Luisa Casona. What strategies can climate campaigners use to transform ambitious environmental targets into binding international agreements? And I would love the enthusiasm around COP30 coming up later this year. And I'll put the question in the chat as well in case my internet was breaking up.
Perfect, thanks. Hello, everybody. And great to be talking to you from an international environmental conference. I'm actually at the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica at the moment, where we are trying to stop deep sea mining from starting. And I think that's maybe a good place to start, because I think as a campaigner, one of the main questions to ask yourself in coming up with a strategy, particularly for global change, is to focus both on where change is needed, but also where we can create change in this moment. There are so many issues, and that's also an invitation to whatever issue grabs you and energizes you to work on. Get involved, because we need more people. The climate movement is always an open door, but it's really important to make those choices on where we think change can be possible right now. And for me, the global oceans in this moment is the place where we can make change on the scale that is required. And I think that's because, yes, it's very easy to feel demotivated by the barrage of negative headlines that we're seeing, the kind of shock and awe tactics that we're seeing from governments opposed to progressive action, in the US, but also in Argentina and in other places as well. But I think we need to remember that actually in these moments where it can feel like elections are giving us a setback, those have served throughout history as moments to really galvanize social movements and to really affect not just cultural change, but political change at a grand scale. And, I think we need to remember that even in the Cold War, that's when the campaign to put Antarctica off limits entirely to mining and to oil drilling gained global resonance and actually succeeded in getting a moratorium on those practices, so that now the idea of mining Antarctica just feels ludicrous. And that's really set that kind of norm and that paradigm shift. And I think it's also really important for us to remember as campaigners that, actually the main obstacle we face is not drilling for oil, it's not mining machines in the ocean, it's actually the myth that we are powerless to stop things from getting worse. That spread of doom and gloom is actually the biggest barrier that we face. And so we need to be focused on where we can create action, because actually seeing those wins ratchet up that's how we create hope that actually lasts. And so I think, when we're thinking specifically about strategies, there's a number of things you can think about. For me, the global oceans was such a powerful place to try and create change, because in the last few years, that's where we've actually seen some of the rare but very important multilateral victories for the environment. After 2 decades of negotiation, we finalized a high seas treaty, which for the first time actually puts the environment at the center of the global oceans framework. Up till 2 years ago, it wasn't actually possible for governments to work together to create ocean sanctuaries, areas in the global oceans, international waters, that are off limits to destructive industries. There simply wasn't the mechanism for governments to do that. And that sounds something that's really technical, but when we think about when we place areas of the ocean off limits, they actually rebound incredibly quickly. Within just a few years, we're seeing more animals, we're seeing bigger wildlife, we're seeing more abundant wildlife. These are the kind of things that we can see those tangible benefits, and we can really make the case of why environmental protection really, really matters, particularly in somewhere like the ocean, which not only is a pretty non-polarizing topic, which again, we need to jump on those things at this moment, but also is a place where we can see change quickly, and where, particularly in international waters, we have to rely on international cooperation, because these are places that really are our global commons. Similarly, in picking a fight with the deep sea mining industry, for me, this was a really compelling campaign to launch, because it's an industry that has not started yet. There are a handful of companies around the world who are trying to kickstart it, but it doesn't actually have a vested interest at this point. And we can see how difficult it is to push back on the fossil fuel industry, because they have that vested power. It's really great to think of where are their frontier campaigns, where actually international agreement can put places off limits before they get that kind of stranglehold in our economies, and more importantly in our politics. And I think ways that we have really built this movement, where, in just a couple of years, we've managed to get over 30 governments from the Pacific, from Europe, from Latin America, from North America as well, opposing deep sea mining, has really been to build these broad alliances, and to really use that kind of spectrum of tactics that you get across a movement. And I think to also really remember that governments want to be on the winning team, so we need to look like we're having the better party. And I think I'm drawing there on some sort of lessons from an excellent strategist called Anat Schenker-Osario, who also talks about, in campaigning, you've got to sell the brownie, not the recipe. What is the thing that people can gain, and also what is it that politicians can talk about in terms of the change they're making? If I was just going to sit here and talk about the legal framework around the high seas, then no one's going to want to join my campaign. Similarly, with something like the Paris Agreement on climate change, I know I was obsessed with the exact policy mechanisms of having a long-term goal and a ratchet mechanism. And maybe in this bubble, we're all interested in that, but we know that's quite hard to explain, even, to some of our best friends or to our grands. So we need to be thinking about what is the change that can happen as a result of that technical policy detail, and make sure that can connect with people, whether that's making their lives better, or whether it's also appealing to the beauty of the world, the incredible awe-inspiring nature that we have, because we shouldn't also reduce people to just sort of economic consumers. We should also think about what inspires us, what do we wish was sorted out, because we would like the oceans to be full of life rather than mined or extracted from and left as kind of something that we don't think of in our mind's eye when we think of as the oceans. And I think finally, I would just say, we need to build on good examples. So where we get strong local legislation, or particularly national legislation, think about how we can transform that into the international setting. And I think we really saw that with the Paris Agreement on climate change, agreed in 2015. If you look at the mechanism of how it's structured, it really mirrors the UK Climate Change Act, which was a groundbreaking piece of legislation in 2009. We learned lots of lessons through getting that through Parliament, through setting that up in the UK, and then that provided a template that not only could other countries use to put in place climate laws, but actually to create an international framework on climate change. And I think finally, remembering that, yes, there can be setbacks. Yes, we can see election cycles where certain governments will choose to put themselves out of the race, but let's focus on all the very many countries that are staying in something like Paris and the vast amount of emissions that they cover, the vast amount of change that can be found around the world. And that, for me, is what inspires me about global campaigning, is that actually, yes, you can have a setback on one front, but there's the whole rest of the world where incredible campaigning and progress can be made.
Great. Thank you, Louisa. It was terrific and particularly resonant for me is getting in. I'll turn now finally to Daniele Visioni, and also on the subject of an industry that has not yet scaled up meaningfully, which at all there. But I want to ask Daniele, what do you see as the most pressing knowledge gaps that policymakers need to address before considering large-scale geoengineering as part of any comprehensive climate strategy? And I'll put the question in the chat once again.
Thank you. Yeah, I got the last part, but not the first part. Actually, you broke off when you said the word industry, and I wonder if you were connecting that to the word geoengineering. Then my first answer would be, I really hope it never becomes an industry, as in it. I never hope that within the context of thinking or talking about geoengineering, we would think about that sort of on the profit-driven side. It's probably the most dangerous thing that we could do. So I'll take a step back though and say, well, also what is geoengineering, just in case people are wondering, and also why, right? We've heard already discussions of Paris Agreement, 1.5 and emissions. Pretty obvious observation coming out also from the WMO a couple of days ago. In a way, yes, we are way on course for crossing the boundaries, the thresholds defined by the Paris Agreement. We have already gone past 1.5, even considering decadal means. We will most likely also blow past the 2 degrees Celsius threshold that the Paris Agreement sort of found non-negotiable. This is depressing. It's also true. Yeah, it's true. But on the other hand, it's also true that there's a lot of movement and a lot of effort going on. So it is clear that we also have the capacity long-term as a society to curb emissions and make sure that climate change doesn't get out of hand. The question, in the part that the question about geoengineering tries to answer is, will that be enough? Since we know that every 1/10 of a degree leads to more risks, more climate risk, leads to risk to biodiversity, leads to risk to humans through heat waves. Will it be enough? Will country always agree that just curbing emission be enough? Or will countries or actors in one or another decide that we need to intervene more actively on climate to make sure that some of these risks can be curtailed or ameliorated? And is that even possible? Fundamentally, this is the idea behind geoengineering, whether that's carbon dioxide removal aimed at reducing the concentrations of CO2, or solar geoengineering aimed at actually actively cooling the planet. For now, important also to note, none of these technologies exist at scale, and in many cases beyond the purely theoretical. But a lot of groups, a lot of research is being spent into trying to figure out whether any or all of these potential ideas are in any way feasible. There's a lot of things we definitely don't know, and again, born from the fact that we can use observation and understanding of the climate system to try to understand what the impacts would be, but it is hard to make final determination on things without actually testing, and that's sort of part of the contentious issue. So the thing is, how can we even determine whether it makes sense to test things like geoengineering technologies or schemes? Who gets to decide? None of these technologies, a bit like emissions, but from a different framework, stay just where they are. You can think about local methods to do direct air capture. This is a carbon dioxide removal method that just sucks air and removes part of the CO2. Incredibly energy intensive, unclear how it works at scale. You can think of many different methods. You can use your agricultural land to grow more trees or bioenergy fuels to capture the carbon, but you could be using your land for other things. And what will the people think about you using that to capture carbon? You could think about increasing the oceanic carbon sink, but as Luisa said, well, the ocean belongs to everyone. Who gets to decide whether you can do something like that? How do you monitor and verify the claims that one could make about capturing more carbon into the deep ocean? And same thing for more direct kind of cooling. Who would be there to ascertain whether the claims of a country that is doing that for the benefit of their own citizens, who would be there to decide whether that's actually happening, whether that's being harmful to other countries or to other groups of people, and really who gets to decide? So fundamentally, the concept of geoengineering falls within this category of which you need, in a way, a high trust in science to even begin considering that. You definitely need a high level of acknowledging the risks that come out of climate change, and potentially some willingness to admit the fact that no solution is perfect and that trade-offs will always be present, but that there has to be a way in which you evaluate the trade-offs. And this doesn't have to be just raw numbers, not just number of deaths, but also ethical consideration over what is just and what is not just. Fundamentally, one could get lost into just discussing the quibbles and details of all of these, but a point that a lot of other speakers before me and have made is really this idea that acknowledging there's a sort of, one could admit of a positive spin to the whole idea of geoengineering by acknowledging the fact that you need to admit that we all live on this planet, and that whatever kind of action we decide to take will have global implications, and therefore requires not just, again, acknowledging the science and the risks of climate change, but also acknowledging the fact that the best way, if not the only way, to make these decisions in a fair way is to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table and that countries cooperate in agreeing that the world, this planet, is sort of our global good, and we have to be stewards of that.
Terrific. Thank you, Daniele. I want to open up a question for us all to discuss as a group. Which is, do we think that climate change has fostered more cooperation or has intensified more geopolitical competition?
I mean, I think that you know, the impacts that we are already seeing of climate change, we know they exacerbate global power inequalities, and that the impacts are not felt evenly, but that we will all experience them. And so I think, you know, we have seen, I think, particularly some really creative uses of different international frameworks, particularly from the most affected countries, to continue to try and raise the issues of equity and the need for greater ambition on climate action, particularly from the countries that are most responsible and continue to be most responsible. So here I'm thinking, for example, of the advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice that was heard at the end of last year. And that really you know, started with a campaign that was discussed at a university in the South Pacific by university students who were thinking, hang on, we're not seeing countries step up to even, you know, the obligations that we thought they'd signed up to in the Paris Agreement. So how can we actually use international law and the kind of courts available to us to actually try and force the issue? You know, and they got the support of Vanuatu and others who have brought that now to the sort of highest courts in international law. Similarly, we've seen really creative questions being raised at ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, also about, because we're seeing, the ocean as a real frontline for climate impacts, how can we use that court to, again, try and compel countries to be doing more? So, I think as we experience climate change, it's such a kind of push and pull, and we are seeing both moments of really inspiring collective action, but we're also seeing some of the worst being brought out, and that real sense of sort of, I think the nightmarish vision of a real breakdown and fracturing in international cooperation. And I think that there are both the physical realities of climate change, that because of the amount that we have emitted to date, some of those are now baked in and we have to deal with them. The choices we have are the political and social and economic choices about how we choose to deal with it. So I think we have to take that kind of question as a real challenge for, okay, where can we push and actually make sure that cooperation is what wins out. And I was at a climate politics conference about a year ago, and I think what was really interesting there was the general mood was, wow, this is not the political setup that we would have wanted to try and deal with climate change in the mid 2020s. But actually, let's look at what's happening in clean tech, and that's going much better than we thought. And I think initially there'd been a lot of sense of, we need the policy to really speed up and accelerate the clean energy transition, and to get the sort of policy in place to really unlock innovation and that rapid decarbonisation. But actually, in some ways, we're at that place in a lot of countries now. We're seeing, the number of electric vehicles booming. The amount that, China were selling. I think it was over 1 million electric vehicles in December alone. That was a kind of 40% increase compared to the previous year, and that other countries like Vietnam are also massively outperforming the predictions for how many electric vehicles are coming online. I think similarly, the amount of solar and wind that we're seeing in places in the world is smashing through the predictions. So I think where we really need to see an increase in policy attention is actually in terms of resilience, adaptation, loss and damage, and actually dealing with the fact that we're in a climate changed world. And that's where the cooperation at the moment, I think, is really lacking, and where we need to make sure that we are listening to the communities and the governments who are really on the front line and will be most affected, and think about what our policy responses are in the international community. And that is not just focusing on mitigation. It's obviously recognizing that the more we mitigate, the better the situation we will be in. But we also need to recognize the realities that, due to the misinformation that was pushed for a long time by industry, we aren't where we want to be. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. Jan.
I would like to join in this part of the conversation. So I like to think that there is more cooperation going on, because cooperation leads to our solution. But I'm also seeing that a lot of underlying power exists within market forces. So the tailwinds we're getting of change in the clean tech world are coming from the changing conditions of economic markets for those goods, right? And it's hard to block those forces once they really get going. But I think one of the areas of competition that we have are with some of the more some of the countries where fossil fuels are still the mainstay, or people want to make fossil fuels the mainstay and resist this change. And a lot of the clean tech advancements and investments have not yet pierced that threshold where they're not only adding more capacity onto existing electrical grids, they're eating into the fossil fuel market, and doing so past whatever the threshold was for coal, right? So I think that where we have competition in this space of mitigation, it's about the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and existing nation states, either acting individually or as a bloc, in concert, in their policy making and the positions they take in the COP. On the adaptation side, there are so many different things to work on, right? Like that you don't have that gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, as massive as it is in our global emissions every year. You don't have that kind of unifying metric to organize around. And I think that this creates a wider spread problem. Like, local governments are being encouraged to create forecasts of the costs of doing nothing, for example. So, like, what is that risk and damage? What's that financial number look like? And how does that grow over time because of the increasing climate exacerbated hazards and the effect that they're going to have on your existing assets and your existing tax base? I think that the more that we see climate impacts occur over the world, the more we are seeing two major threats that can start to be more significant metrics for understanding adaptation and resilience, or the lack of it. And one of those is obviously climate migration, which is a rapidly growing area of competition in policy, or backsliding in cooperation for nation states, they acting in complex political ways. But another area of it can be understood as the emergence of a material financial risk, for not for the financial markets writ large necessarily, but for the entities like local governments that need to enact change on the ground. So we're seeing some of the first ever actions now in the wake of the LA area fires, where we finally saw a downgrading of LA Department Water, and I shouldn't say finally, we saw downgrading of LA Department of Water and Power's credit rating on the basis not only of the impact of the fires, but on the basis of future climate risk. And this is in the wake of massive changes occurring in the insurance industry across the US, which I take to be the first domino to fall in the cascading impact that will occur in the financial industry due to climate impacts. It takes only 2 years for the retail insurance industry to pull out of any market. So it kind of, if you think about it in those terms, that window of opportunity, insurance is taking action now, and it will continue to take action and pose eventually what will be existential problems on local communities and their tax base. But if we zoom out and see, like, what are going to be the next dominoes to fall, credit ratings tend to focus on a 10-year time frame, although they're trying to start to look further out on the lifespan of assets in their measures. And so the idea that we're starting to see some of the first downgrades in credit ratings as a result of climate risk are a really big deal for markets. And so I think that these signals, as they grow, as these financial signals of material loss, as they grow, we're going to see what happens. Either we're going to get more cooperation as a result, because we're seeing at a national level where these impacts are going to go in ways that weren't forecasted by economists looking at climate, right? Or we're going to get more infighting inside of nation states, and with that more divisiveness and polarization. And I don't know, I just tend to be an optimist because hope springs from somewhere. And being, working so much at at the local level allows me to maintain that sense of optimism that we can build from the bottom up and cooperate.
And Jan, I'll hop in to say, in a both encouraging and discouraging way, I think the global scramble for critical minerals shows us at once how climate change can cause competition, but also shows the nations of the world banking on an energy transition. All of this saber rattling around Greenland, everything that China's been doing to very effectively dominate supply chains for EV batteries, it shows that even though there can be such climate cynicism, that that the leaders of some of the most powerful and ambitious nations in the world are, they might be hedging their bets, but they are preparing for a future in which rapid, deep decarbonization happens, and in which they want to be a part of it. And so in a sense, we can look at that kind of competition, and we should look at it critically, obviously, especially when it becomes, imperial. But also, I in the silver linings department, I think it's useful to see how a little bit of competition isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's in the context of a sort of race to zero.
Oh, I really agree, and thanks for bringing up that issue. So I think you think Johan wants to join in, so I'll mute and have him take.
Yeah, maybe to comment on that, really, really great comments, because critical situation, as Daniel mentioned, and we're taking enormous risks for humanity. The good news is that a large part of the economy has commitments to have net zero targets, 3% compared to race to zero. A challenge, as far as we see it, is that in order to bend the curve, we might be close to bending the curve. We can't just focus on fossil economy by just focusing on the down curves. The key point why we haven't been able to bend from our perspective is that we don't scaling up the solution sufficiently fast to shift out the fossil economy, because the fossil economy did this to ambulances, to energy, which we need from a human perspective. So the key point which we have underestimated is there has been all the focus on the down curves, cutting emissions, whereas real strong opportunity to focus on actually accelerating the solutions much, much faster and exponentially, which is of course, and they are growing exponentially, like renewable energy in particular, solar, wind, and so on. They're following these trajectories. And there are other solutions which are not scaling sufficiently fast, of course, like the material transformation, which is maybe the second and third halving. It's the regen agriculture, sustainable forestry. So we need to have really in the beginning of the curves that makes it possible to push these developments much faster. Where I see an opportunity is actually some kind of positive competition, like a race to the top, because the new solutions are absolutely superior. It's more a question on how fast it will go. So it is an opportunity to win that economy, both for companies and value chains perspective as well. So I think that positive competition is something which is an opportunity. Because do you like to win that new economy, or do you like to stay with the typewriters, the old economy? The race to the top is an opportunity, and to really create examples among the leaders that this is building the new jobs and the new prosperity. Collaboration between country plans, And company transition plans, they need to be connected, and also with the finance community, because we're working a lot in parallel for companies in the forefront to really scale these strong supply and demand policies. And that is primarily what is blocking scaling, in my opinion, right now. So turning it more from sharing of burden to an opportunity to win the new economy is a great opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Johan. I think we'll turn over to audience Q&A now, and thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Given my unstable internet connection, I've asked Luisa to please facilitate our audience Q&A, so I'll turn it over now.
Thank you. So some great questions, and I think some of them we have touched on. We're planning to stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes or so. So maybe we jump to the question on how can nations align national interests with global environmental goals to ensure long-term cooperative solutions. Daniele, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I was actually thinking, yeah, that sounds like a great question. I would answer that in many cases, the way how to do that is to think about long-term goals and interests, and that sometimes countries are pretty quick in thinking about their sort of short-term interests, and they see how much they differ from sort of the broader global environmental goals. But taking the long view is the thing that helps a lot of times. I'll go back to an alignment between those two. So I would say take an evidence-based, the way they can do that is to take an evidence-based approach to risks arising from climate change, acknowledging that ecosystems don't really know boundaries, and that eventually we all benefit, and countries benefit, and citizens benefit from healthy ecosystems in every possible aspect. So this requires some shift into how countries think about their interests, but going back to the question also about positive examples, one could say, you know, there's plenty of forums like the United Nations Environmental Assembly or the Montreal Protocols that have demonstrated that these can be done.
I would also add, I think from an infrastructure planning perspective, it's very concerning when we see nations building serious fossil fuel infrastructure, which is going to lock in a reliance on oil and gas. And it's sort of self-explanatory, but in terms of aligning national interests with global environmental goals, we really like to see planning for an almost zero emissions future in 2050. And when you're building serious infrastructure that, you know, the sorts of municipal things that Jan was talking about that have 30, 40, 50, 80-year expected lifespans, it's very encouraging when we see those aligned with low carbon futures.
I think one of the keys to allowing that infrastructure substitution to occur, that I'm not sure to what degree that's really been exercised. Maybe in some parts of the US, like in the Pacific Northwest, we had an agreement forged across several states to eliminate reliance on coal. And that led to agreements to prematurely end the useful life of a series of assets and come to agreements for the dates that each of those assets would stop functioning. And this got me thinking about more globally, what would it look like if countries started to take stock of those stranded assets, those assets that we will have to cease functioning prior to the end of their useful life in order to meet our goals, and start to understand what does it look like, what could it look like to buy out those systems and those functions? What could that financial price tag be? because I think that at some point there'll have to be a reckoning with the stranded assets that the assets that we have to walk away from in order to be able to accommodate our net zero goals. This as something similar can be said for adaptation and resilience. Obviously, there's human loss and that occurs, but coming right down to some kind of financial estimates of what's at stake with the changing levels of magnitude and frequency of harms that occur as a result of rising greenhouse gas emissions and rising temperatures. So really understanding that kind of financial basis for change, I think, can help move the dialogue along. And I don't really see enough yet at scale happening in terms of climate budgeting in order to support that dialogue from like the local up to the national scale and into international discourse. Although I think that's something the organized island states have really been trying to make the case well on the global stage for some time on that.
Thanks, Jan, and others. And I think, you know, what's really interesting is seeing this kind of discussion more and more of national interests overlapping with actually global environmental goals, but using totally different framing or interests in realizing actually maybe the outcome is the same. There's actually a piece in a British quite right-wing newspaper today in the Telegraph, which was entitled "Will Trump's Oil Triumphalism End in American Tears?" And it was actually talking about, you know, while there is a lot of rhetoric of, you know, pumping out, you know, more fossil fuels is in the national interest. Actually, this is taking a global perspective and citing some new research by the Carlyle Group that actually a diversified energy mix is becoming the choice for so many nations across the world to insulate themselves from geopolitical risks, from macro risks, from financial risks, and really looking actually at, you know, the fact that a lot of nations, particularly emerging nations within Asia, are not choosing to lock themselves in to LNG and to oil exports because actually they're seeing the security benefits of clean energy, particularly solar and wind. So I think we're seeing some of that alignment really coming through, which is really interesting, and particularly, you know, I think we shouldn't underestimate the levels of support that we're seeing from perhaps sort of unusual allies and friends there. Just to move us on to another one of the excellent questions, and this one is really simply worded, but I think might lead to a really interesting discussion. This one is, what will be the key milestones for climate action in the future? And I don't know, Johan, if you want to kick us off here.
I think that we put out as a sort of key milestone is, of course, halving emissions. But I would say that the more immediate milestone, as far as I see it, is actually when we can show that the curve is bending on a global, be reasonably close to that, because I think there is an opportunity to accelerate the transformation just when we come over basically that about the emissions. Of course, there could be different perspectives on this particular question. So that is one thing that I think we are in a difficult moment, but we should be aware of all the progress that's been done the last. I would say that when we made the first exponential roadmap, I think it was 6-7 years ago. I think we had the solutions, identified the solutions to cut emissions by 50%. But I would say today, full solutions to do the first and second halving. And we have a tremendous number of companies and actors stepping up. But to shift the economy in a new direction takes time and effort. So it's really important to push us over the next step where the curve is bending. And I think another milestone is when the leading, country and companies and value chain realize that it's becoming a race basically to win the new clean economy in all areas, then it can go much, much faster. And today we are in a little bit in between, but I think it's possible to come to that point. I'm an optimist, yes.
I'll add to what Johan said. I think most people on the call will be familiar with the idea of the marginal cost of abatement, which is that some emissions are free or even you make money by not emitting them. And some are very expensive to emit. And we've been in a situation for the last 10 or 20 years where we've started to really dive into the low cost abatement options. And I think a key milestone that we'll start looking for in 5 or 10 years is whether we're really seeing the kind of appetite and bite that we need to get into those medium and higher cost abatement. And it remains to be seen at this point. I think it's imperative that we stay optimistic, but it gets back to this question of how are we going to scale up climate finance to get these really important win for the last 20 years of climate action.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think great to have a whole panel of optimists here, of people who are getting stuck in, and the best way to stay optimistic is to be doing lots on this subject. So I hope that's, it doesn't feel baseless. It feels like the people who are actually really engaging, and I hope those of you who are listening feel similar, that actually the best antidote to doom is to get involved and to find a way to be part of pushing things along. I think we probably have time for one more discussion point, and I think hopefully some of our answers have touched on those that we're not able to answer directly. But I think, perhaps one that we haven't spoken about in so much detail is how do developed and developing nations differ in their approach to climate change, and how does this impact global unity? Who'd like to go first on that one?
I can say briefly just, well, fundamentally here, there is an observation that we see now at the COPs, at the Conference of the Parties, from the developing countries, highlighting how the rising climate risks are affecting their capacity to actually fight climate change and even mitigate their own emission. And so there's a, in a way, growing divide between countries that are demanding a strong loss and damage fund, for instance, from developed countries, and the developed countries, especially the US, even before November, sort of refusing to acknowledge the need for a loss and damage fund. So clearly, the developing nations are also the ones that are feeling the largest impacts from climate change already. And if we don't face that, and if we let things like the loss and damage fund go the same way as the transition fund, so that has always been underfunded compared to pledges, it will be very unlikely that we will get in any way at these through sort of a global unity. So fundamentally, the burden is on the developed nations to acknowledge not just the responsibility, but also then how differently they have to act against all of this.
I think I'd like to add a little bit about finance to this discussion, because if we're talking about developing nations, we could be talking about parts of the world that have very limited or even no access to international finance beyond multilateral development banks such as the World Bank. And in some parts of the world, that's even by design, where local governments are restricted from going beyond their own national development banks or their or private lending institutions within their own country. And being able to change that those institutional arrangements, like there's been very limited movement in that regard. What I do see happening that's encouraging, though, are the actions of some networks of cities, such as like the C40 Cities Network, ECLAY, and to some extent the Global Covenant of Mayors. And when local governments that are highly influential within their own national markets, when local governments that are highly influential pick up policy prescriptions that come from other parts of the world, and they can make a case within their own country for piloting and then instituting changes that resemble those policies on a national scale. So, for example, New York City had instituted climate budgeting, and it didn't take very long for folks in the C40 network to see Mumbai exercise in quite a similar way, not exactly the same, but a similar way, climate budgeting with their own cast of engineers and actors, and more recently as well, in India, they've started to launch a green bond finance market. And even though there are restrictions on international investing in that market due to lack of currency exchange supports, the initial offerings of those bonds were oversubscribed and brought down the cost of finance by several basis points. So I think there are signs that are really quite encouraging about policy change and policy distribution that can lead to larger scale up.
Thanks so much, Jan, for bringing that in. And I think, we're going to see a lot of these issues continue to play out over this year and beyond. I think there was a question earlier around what can we look out for this year. We are seeing things both be really strained by certain loud voices on the global stage, but we're also seeing a lot of really positive signs at different levels across different sectors. And I think, what's interesting as well is really seeing Brazil, who are hosting the climate summit at the end of this year, really connecting this not just to, a forum that is about climate change, but really a defense of international cooperation more generally. We had comments recently from the guy who will preside over this COP30 summit saying, we have the firm conviction that there is no future progress for humanity without deep, rapid and sustained cooperation among all countries. And this is the government that has also sort of really challenged G20 leaders to step up, to accelerate their net zero pledges and to not get dissuaded, and really to sort of use this challenging moment as an opportunity to step up. So a lot to look out for. I will be seeing whether we can actually get that moratorium on deep sea mining in one of these fora where we don't have the US having a seat at the table and a vote. But I hope all of you listening are plotting away and planning lots of a really important work related to these questions. And I hope that this amazing panel has given you that sense that there's a lot to play for. We're really in that contested moment where our collective efforts make so much difference. So a big thank you to everyone who's been watching and participating with these fantastic questions, and a big thank you to everyone on the panel for your brilliant insights and really thought-provoking comments. Thanks so much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.